HM are the anonymized initials of one of the most famous case studies in brain science. The man we now know as Henry Molaison suffered seizures as a young man that were so severe they were interfering with his livelihood. So he went to a neurosurgeon at Hartford, Connecticut by the name of William Scoville. And trying to cure him of his epilepsy, Scoville tried a procedure that he later admitted was frankly experimental. He put Henry under local anesthetic, made an incision in the scalp, and pulled his forehead skin over his eyes. Then, while Molaison was still conscious, he used drill bits that looked a little like cookie cutters to make two holes about this size and this size in the skull. Then he used a retractor to push up the frontal lobe. He pushed a metal straw into the cranial cavity, and he sucked out about 2/3 of Henry Molaison's hippocampus. The operation did help alleviate Henry's seizures, but Scoville also created history's most famous amnesiac. From that day on, Henry could no longer remember anything that happened beyond the last 30 seconds. I am named William after Dr. William Beecher Scoville, the surgeon who operated on Henry Molaison. In this video, I want to tell you more about Molaison and what he meant to science. But I also want to tell you about the intersection between my life and the life of the man that operated on him. Let's start with Henry's story, and then we'll get to mine. Henry Molaison was knocked over by a boy on a bicycle when he was 9, gashing his head badly. It is thought that this accident may have caused or contributed to the debilitating seizures which he later suffered from. These were grave and interfered seriously with his life. For instance, he wasn't allowed on stage for his high school graduation because the teachers were scared that he would have an episode. By the time he was 27, the seizures were interfering with his livelihood as a motor repairman. So, in 1952, he went to the office of Dr. William Beecher Scoville, who incidentally was related to Harriet Beecher Stowe, the author of Uncle Tom's Cabin. After exhausting other treatment options, Scoville proposed a surgery which we've already described, with the outcome we've already described. So, what was it like being Henry Molaison? Imagine not being able to remember anything that happened more than 30 seconds ago. It would be difficult or impossible to develop relationships with people because not only would you not be able to remember their name, you wouldn't be able to recall your shared history together. Henry greeted the nurses that took care of him every day as if they were strangers. You'd not be able to remember practical details like passwords, for instance, or the location of things. You would not be able to trace our place in history the way we do by checking the news. Henry could tell you who the U.S. presidents were up until his date with Scoville, but he could not name any U.S. presidents after his surgery. You would not be able to enjoy a novel, for instance, because you wouldn't be able to follow the plot. And you would not be able to remember the story of yourself. We all live with a biographical explanation of how we got to this place, and dreams or expectations of what is to come. Henry had some memory of his previous life, but he was not able to continue authoring himself as we do every day of our lives. That was surely a tragedy for Henry Molaison. But it was a boon for science. After the operation, Scoville recognized the scientific significance of this case, so he reached out to a distinguished peer, Wilder Penfield of the Montreal Neurological Institute. Penfield introduced him to a brilliant young neuropsychologist named Brenda Milner. Scoville would co-author with Milner the paper that introduced HM to the scientific world. Milner's experiments and observations with HM have laid an evidentiary basis for much of what we know about memory. As far back as the 19th century, William James had theorized about what he called primary and secondary memory. But Henry Molaison's malady showed that short-term and long-term memory were separate systems in the brain. Milner documented that and traced these processes to the anatomy of the brain. Milner also used a clever experiment to show that declarative and procedural memory were separate systems. Now, declarative memory is the memory you can declare. For example, I had coffee with Jane yesterday, or in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. Procedural memory, on the other hand, is the memory your body remembers. How your fingers form a G chord on a guitar neck, for instance. Milner had Henry learn a simple skill. In this case, it was mirror drawing. In this exercise, you trace the shape of a star while looking at it through a mirror, while your direct view of the paper is blocked. At first, it's difficult because the directions are reversed in the mirror, but eventually you get the hang of it. As we've said, Henry did not have access to declarative memory of events or facts. But Milner discovered that even though he might not remember doing the mirror exercise yesterday or the day before, he did get better at it. He kept the skill to draw the arrow in his hands. That proved that procedural memory and declarative memory were separate systems in the brain. That's the story of how Henry Molaison lost his memory in William Scoville's operating room, and a summary of the most important things we have learned from him. Now, let me tell you about how another operation in that same Hartford hospital made it possible for me to come into this world. The story begins in Lima, Peru in 1960, before I was born. Jorge Agadea, a young father of 4, is diagnosed with a herniated disc. A respected local neurosurgeon, Dr. Fernando Cavieses, operates. Within days, the patient's condition is deteriorating, and he is soon paralyzed from the neck down, quadriplegia. Cavieses didn't know it, but the problem wasn't a disc. A congenital cyst, present in the spinal column since before my father's birth, had begun to grow and pressure the cord. Cavieses' surgery allowed the cyst room to grow and bloom, causing the paralysis. Now, just because my father was quadriplegic doesn't mean he wasn't feeling pain. My father described terrible spasms during that time. The only thing that alleviated the pain was neck traction, essentially hanging from the ceiling by a harness around his neck. Let me caution, I got this next part of the story only from my father's telling. I can't document it, and it does sound strange to me, but this is what I was told. My father suggested that Cavieses thought the condition was terminal, that organ failure was soon to come, and that the doctor suggested removing muscles from his body to ease the pain from the spasms. Of course, my father said no way, he wanted a second opinion. And Cavieses told him, look, the only one who might be able to cure you is my teacher in America, Dr. William Scoville. So my father and mother scraped together some financial assistance from my extended family and my father's Masonic lodge, and they flew to Hartford to put themselves in the care of the soon-to-be miraculous Dr. Scoville. In my father's telling, things moved very fast once they got to Hartford. Scoville performed a number of tests, including a myelogram. It's an exam where a tracer liquid is injected into the spinal column, and the patient is placed on a mechanical table that tilts so that the flow of the liquid can reveal any obstructions in the spinal column. Now, these days, the myelogram has been mostly replaced by the MRI, but at the time it was a state-of-the-art diagnosis tool. Scoville's diagnosis was the same as Caviezel's. He thought it was a herniated disc too. But Scoville had the wherewithal to keep poking around until he discovered the real problem, the cyst. It was about the size of a grape, and Scoville was able to find and remove it. The very next day, my father was taking his first steps in many weeks. And except for his left arm being a little weaker than his right arm, he made a full recovery. He must have been moving around pretty good because soon after the operation, I was conceived. And after I was born, I was named William in honor of the doctor that gave my father his life back. In the process of doing research for my book, Arrow, The Power and Poison of Story, I dug up a medical paper that Scoville and Caviezel jointly wrote about my father's case. The first thing that struck me was seeing my father referred to as JG. Here he attained the same initialed anonymity that HM had. The paper confirms what my father used to say, that Scoville was proud of his operation. It heralds a first ever surgical recovery from a rare condition. Although a somewhat sheepish footnote added months after the initial writing admits that neither the condition nor the recovery was quite that rare. So, as you might expect, William Scoville became something of a demi-God in my family. The doctor stayed in contact with us, even visiting us in Peru once in the mid-60s. Here's a photo I found of him at our home during that time. My mom used to tell a story about that visit. I was too young to remember this, but her dad, my grandfather, had come to visit us from Uruguay at that time. And as he sat in the living room with Scoville, Grandpa's leg kept twitching. There was a spasm that was bothering him. My mom could see that Scoville was watching this movement and it was driving him nuts. So finally, Scoville gets up, grabs a heavy glass ashtray. And at this point, when my mom was telling the story many years later to friends, she would point to the actual ashtray he had picked up. And Scoville tapped my grandfather's knee to check the reflex. He asks a couple of quick questions and then gives his diagnosis. Apparently, one of Grandpa's feet was swollen, which made him choose to wear two different shoes, one looser than the other. The soles of these two shoes weren't the same thickness. That tiny tilt was throwing his whole posture and pinching a nerve in his lower back. Scoville said that if my grandfather switched to matching shoes, the problem would vanish. He did, and my mother would say, Scoville was proven right again. We held on to that glass ashtray, and I remember I would sometimes hold it like it was the relic of a saint. My dad liked to tell a different story about that visit from Scoville. He took the doctor to the Inca Museum in Lima, and one of the exhibits there had some Inca skulls with perfect round incisions. Scoville was fascinated by the fact that the bone had healed, meaning the patients had survived the surgery. And Scoville's conclusion was that judging from the place where they were cutting, the Incas were operating on personality. My dad loved that story because it combined two of his favorite themes, the genius of the Incas and the genius of Scoville. Later, when I learned more about Scoville's own interest in psychosurgery, I wondered if he wasn't perhaps a little bit jealous of his Inca colleagues. You see, Scoville was one of the pioneers in popularizing the lobotomy in the United States, one of the more dismal chapters in 20th century medicine. Now, before rushing to judgment, though, we need to put his efforts in a proper historical context. In the 1950s, Psychosurgery was considered a serious science. A decade earlier, Antonio Agas Moniz was awarded the Nobel Prize for pioneering the procedure. This was before the arrival of the pharmaceutical alternatives that eventually replaced lobotomy. This was a time when mental patients were often crammed into overcrowded wards, suffering terrible mental anguish. Lobotomy was viewed as a humane intervention for these extreme cases. Yes, some of the brain's higher functioning was lost, but great pain was averted. Also, Scoville was far more sensitive to the side effects of lobotomy than many of his colleagues were. Around this time, Walter Friedman was streamlining the procedure into a 10-minute long process where an instrument similar to an ice pick was poked through the eye sockets, disabling patients that included JFK's sister. Scoville, on the other hand, was refining what he felt was a subtler, less damaging method that he called orbital undercutting. But Scoville was complicit in the big problem with the lobotomy. It was the lobotomists who decided how successful they were. Even in our day of evidence-based medicine, clinical trials for new surgical techniques are a rarity. That's problematic, but less so when the results can at least be measured reliably. An orthopedic surgeon testing a new knee operation, for example, can assess postoperative flexibility and strength down to precise degrees and pounds of pressure. Measuring psychic pain is far more difficult, and crucially, weighing alleviation of pain against loss of intellect and higher functioning is exceedingly difficult. That is as much a philosophical as a medical problem, and that is what the neurosurgeons needed to decide. Such a subjective call should not be left to doctors who have a possible attachment to their handiwork. It's not clear that Scoville's judgment was always sound in this regard. On Henry Molaison's chart prior to discharge, Scoville marked his patient's condition after the operation as improved. And in a 1960 paper, he wrote that lobotomy is more appropriate for patients who have a low cultural background. Presumably, this is because he believed that people with a lower educational level were less likely to miss the higher intellectual capacities that a lobotomy might damage, but really, that's an outrageous presumption. Scoville didn't just start performing psychosurgeries earlier than most. He held on to their practice longer, too. By the mid-70s, lobotomies had almost disappeared, rendered obsolete by drug therapies and electroshock treatment. But Scoville kept on performing them, even though he admitted that they came with a price. The blunting of things like intelligence, abstract thinking, and the ability to fantasize. An important point here, my family knew nothing about HM back then. I didn't learn about it until the mid-90s. I was flipping through the Sunday paper, and Scoville's name leapt off the page. A review in New York Times of Philip Hilt's Memories Ghost, a book about HM. The review made Scoville sound cavalier, cracking jokes about the thing to his wife. I remember thinking, I wish Poppy were alive to hear this. But at a later point, when I was doing my research, I lined up the dates and I realized my father was alive then. So why didn't I tell him? I probably didn't tell my father about HM operation because such an act might be considered an attempt to topple Scoville's statue off its pedestal. Such an affront to Scoville might be upsetting to my father or awkward for me, so I chose not to tell him. And years after I made the decision not to tell him, I chose to think he had died by that time because the decision not to tell him made me feel small. I would have to admit to myself that I was fearful of my father's reaction, and I prefer to see myself as strong and independent, so I changed the memory to conform with that self-appraisal. I changed the story so it'd be more flattering to me. Our memories perhaps are a little like dots, and we build sort of a regression line through them. The line is a story of who we are. Over time, maybe we fudge and nudge the dots closer towards the line with a trajectory that we like, a trajectory that flatters us. Maybe that's what I did there, which brings me back to Henry. He couldn't create that autobiographical line, not just because he couldn't place dots down, he couldn't remember the place of that constructed line, the story of himself. There's a phrase that Henry used repeatedly, according to the people that took care of him. I'm having an argument with myself. It's such a strange phrase, accurate when you are uncertain. You are having an argument with yourself, but it's not how most people express themselves. You have to wonder when Henry got his long-term memory sucked out of his head, did he also lose some of the ability to craft a unitary self? Let me do what Henry Molaison couldn't. Let me remember the rest of the story for you, because it's not over. We moved to the Dominican Republic in 1976. Not long after, Scoville visited. Before I tell you about that visit, let me tell you about the legend of Scoville, how other people close to him have described him. As a young man, he was movie star handsome, and that I can say photos confirm. He was bold, dashing. He met his first wife jumping onto the running board of her moving car. A great meet cute moment for a movie, I think. And he was a daredevil. He is said to have climbed to the top of George Washington Bridge by its cable late at night on a dare. He's also said to have jumped into a bull ring with a live bull. In high school, he wanted to be a mechanic, but his dad pushed him into a proper profession, medicine. But he never lost the tinkerer streak. He invented and refined many neurosurgical tools, some of which are still in use. And he never lost his love of cars. In his case, Jaguars, which he kept in peak shiny condition. My mom told me that he offered to lend one to her so she could get around on one of her visits to Hartford. She declined. The man I met many years later in Santo Domingo was quieter. Maybe by the time you get to your 70s, we all get a bit quieter. He had a second wife then, a French-speaking, handsome woman, and two young kids. We took them to Vesuvio, then the fanciest spot on Santo Domingo's oceanfront promenade, El Malecón. And Scoville felt a little distant at dinner. But when my dad lit a post-meal cigarette, he snapped to attention. He told my father firmly to quit. My dad wasn't easily scolded, but that night he smoked his last cigarette. And he could change his memories to flatter himself, too. When he talked later about quitting cigarettes, he always said, "Oh, I just woke up one morning and they suddenly disgusted me." Right. Knowing Scoville liked adventure, my father arranged with a wealthy friend for a deep-sea fishing trip. The weather looked dicey, so our host, the boat's owner, suggested canceling. Scoville would not have it. Perhaps he imagined himself battling a marlin a la Hemingway. I was happy about that because I was really looking forward to going out too. Alas, there was no marlin, just very choppy seas. And by the end of the trip, Scoville looked a bit pale and bonked his head on a sun cover on the way off the boat. He looked a bit fragile on that day. Something less than a demi-God, disappointed, queasy, holding the sore spot. But at the end of his visit to DR, he turned to me and he said, "If you decide on medicine, I'll write you a recommendation for Yale Medical School." My dad was over the moon. To him, that was basically a guarantee of admission. For me, medicine wasn't remotely on my list of possible occupations. And next time I saw Scoville was a less happy circumstance. I was 17 and getting ready to fly up to start school at NYU. I was literally counting down the days. A few days before my flight, Hurricane David hit the Dominican Republic, one of the most destructive Caribbean hurricanes of the century. Our ground floor apartment was filled with about a foot of water. Outside our taped up windows, the water wasn't even falling, really. It looked more like a blender out there, whizzing horizontally. Trees were down, even within the narrow view of the window. The roof of the house opposite us flew off. 2,000 people died in the Dominican Republic that day. So my dad, who worked for a nonprofit, said he wanted to come north with me to help raise relief funds. And while he was at it, get a checkup with Scoville. Because after many years of good health, the neurological symptoms had been returning. So my father and I flew up to New York and stayed in a medium-rung hotel in the East 20s. On our first night, we saw Woody Allen's Manhattan, and I felt it was a preview of the city I was already falling in love with. The next day, we bussed to Hartford. Scoville greeted my father warmly in his home base. Scoville looked like himself again, collected, competent. He ran some tests and said simply, "I'd like to operate." My father asked if he could go home first to put his affairs in order. Scoville said he'd prefer to do it sooner rather than later. The surgery ran long. Being in the waiting room felt strange, like an overly melodramatic movie. Kind nurse asked if I needed anything. And eventually Scoville came out looking tired and sounding non-committal. He said he found adhesions, scar tissue from previous surgeries, and removed what he could. But when my father woke up, he was mostly paralyzed from the neck down. That's how he spent the rest of his life. A limited hand movement, little sensation in the legs, but wheelchair bound. Years later, after Scoville had passed, my father got an MRI in Los Angeles. Doctors told him the cyst had grown back in a new location. They believed Scoville had operated in the wrong place. Maybe the surgery itself worsened things, maybe not, but clearly a better outcome was possible. If the teenage me had been a grown man, maybe I might have pushed for a second opinion or worried about whether surgery demanding fine motor control should be executed by a septuagenarian. But truthfully, I don't feel guilty. I don't think a 17-year-old could have stood up against the family god. My dad used to say his proudest moment was taking me to kindergarten and watching me be the only kid who didn't cry on the first day. My proudest moment of him was after that last surgery when he invited some charity executives to his hospital room to ask them for those hurricane relief funds. I'd seen this before. When my father asked for money, he never begged. He sold the opportunity to do good. And even flat on his back, with a dark future ahead of him, he could still cast a spell on these stoic New Englanders. So, how do we judge Scoville? I can't judge him harshly. The boldness and overconfidence that's caused Scoville to cripple Henry Molaison is the same boldness and overconfidence that allowed him to cure my father in the first operation and allowed me to enter this world. Without the arrogance of William Beecher Scoville, I would not be here, and you would be doing something else with your time. My father had his own defiance soon after returning to the DR as a quadriplegic. He clashed with his very supportive employer that had made accommodations for his condition, and he quit his job. If they weren't going to do things the right way, his way, then he would send them all to hell. He still found a way, with sacrifices and some lucky breaks, to put me through college. That interior personal narrative, unyielding, heroic, must have been loud in both the men, Scoville and my father. Loud enough to maybe drown out the wispy music of the world sometimes. But I owe a lot to that symphony in their minds. Without my father's stubbornness, would I have had the opportunity to finish my education in the United States? Without Scoville's boldness, would my father have been cured the first time? Would I even exist? Scoville was killed in an automobile accident in 1984. He was backing up on a highway to catch an exit he had missed, and he was rear-ended by another car. Bold to the last. As of the recording of this video, Brenda Milner, the researcher that made the initial discoveries about memory with Henry, is still alive at 107. My father spent the last 19 years of his life in a wheelchair. He died in 1998, complications from bed sores. Henry Molaison, the famed HM, outlived them both. He died in 2008, sparking many wonder-filled obituaries. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe. Hope to see you soon as we continue to explore the question, what is mind?